Good evening. The time is 6:30 p.m. Today is Thursday, March 16th. I'd like to call this Impact Fee Advisory Committee meeting to order. May I have a roll call, please?
Dibble, Delory,
Here.
Mata,
Here.
Onken,
Here.
Guerra,
Here.
Stiegel, James,
Here.
Chase.
Here.
Thank you. We have a quorum. Next, citizen comments. At this time, if any members of the public would like to speak, we invite you up now. Okay, seeing none, I'm going to go ahead and close citizen comments. Citizen comments is now closed. Item number 4, consider impossible action. 4A, review the land use assumptions, capital improvement program, and impact fee methodology for the 2023 City of Kyle Impact Fee Update. Grady Reed.
Can I get my presentation back?
There it is.
Okay. Thank you all. What I really want to do tonight is just kind of present to you all the draft report that I believe that you have and walk you through that as best we can. Answer your questions. If you have questions as I'm going through this presentation, don't feel like you have to wait until the end. Just ask me as I go, and I'll do the best that I can to answer those. The other thing that I would like to just more provide you all information on, I don't need an answer tonight, but discuss if this committee wants to make a recommendation to City Council on what the updated impact fees should be, and just to have you all start thinking about that over the next couple of weeks prior to approving this report. So the first thing that we have to do in Chapter 395 is identify the area in which the city can levy impact fees. What we're proposing is that area be the city's ETJ limits, which is the area within the dashed line there. That certainly covers a wide area outside of the city limits. This is what most cities do for impact fees. They use the ETJ limits as their impact fee boundary. That in no way obligates the city to serve those areas within the ETJ over the next 10 years. All that it does say is that if the city provides either water or wastewater or both to those customers, to those developments, that the city may levy an impact fee within that impact fee service area. You cannot charge impact fees outside of your ETJ unless you have a contractual arrangement with the person that you would be supplying water or wastewater service to. So is there any questions about where these impact fees would apply? Okay. Chapter 395 also says that we have to have a land use plan. I think as I stated at our last meeting, this land use plan in no way has any bearing on what the actual impact fees are. But it is a table that we have to include in the report, so we do. So within the city's ETJ boundary, there's about 33,343 acres. And you can see the current acres listed there as best as we can determine based on zoning and what we think is actually there on the ground. And then I tried the best I could to grow that 10 years in the future, just again, based on what we think the development patterns are gonna be. This is not a detailed land use plan in any way, shape, or form, and your city planners would probably look at this and say, "Oh my gosh, I can't. That's not a good land use plan at all." And I agree, it's not. It is just something that we have to do according to Chapter 395. We want to make sure that the acreages that we do have in there appear to be reasonable. Not that we necessarily did a detailed, just focusing on the land use plan. This next slide just kind of shows our starting points for the number of equivalent units that we have within the water and wastewater system. You can see the number of meters by size in there. So on the water side, you have 11,730 water meters approximately. That's as of, I think, June of 2022. And then you have about 14,398 or so wastewater customers. The city does serve additional wastewater areas that does not serve water to. And then from those number of water meters, we convert those into LUEs or living unit equivalents according to meter sizes and the scaling factors that we have in there. Those scaling factors, that one column that's 1.5, 2.5, those are scaling factors based on the American Water Works Association meter manual, basically. It's an average of the amount of water that you can put typically through those different size meters compared to a standard 5/8" meter, which is the city's standard meter size. So as we're talking about impact fees, and whenever we get to the end of this and we see what the updated impact fees are going to be, again, the thing to keep in mind is that those impact fees also get scaled based on the number of LUEs. So a standard 5/8" meter, a standard home will just pay 1 times the impact fee amount. But if someone comes in with a 4" meter, they're going to pay 25 times whatever the impact fee is. So this is kind of where we start to get into the meat of updating these impact fees. Chapter 395 says that you can include existing assets that have already been built, that the city in some cases has already paid for, or in other cases may still be paying for if they've issued debt for those items. So as long as those facilities have unused capacity, we can roll those costs into this existing impact fee update. The second part of this is new projects. And so we want to take those new projects, we want to try to figure out how much of that capacity we're going to use over the next 10 years, and then we allocate that cost into our 10-year CIP cost. So this table at the top, the first part of that is existing assets, where it says water supply, water treatment, water pumping, ground and elevated storage, and water transmission. We have that project cost column is an estimate of how much those assets cost at time of construction. That data came from the city's fixed assets model, which is basically just a listing of all of the assets that the city maintains for their, we use just the water and wastewater assets, of course, keeps track of their accumulated depreciation when they were installed and the cost that was installed, the cost to install those items. That data is not perfect, but again, that's the best estimate that we have of how much the city's existing assets cost at the time that they were constructed. Within the city's fixed assets system, there were many projects on primarily on the water transmission side that were labeled as developer contributed. And so that means that the developer went and constructed that asset, and then in most cases has dedicated that asset to the city. If that is the case, then we do not include the cost of those assets in this table nor in the impact fee, because the city did not expend funds to create that capacity within the city. An outside source funded those projects. Does that make sense? We also do not include distribution lines. On the water side and on the wastewater side, we do not include small diameter wastewater collection lines. So think water transmission mains are your larger transmission mains, 6, 12 inches. We do not include the individual distribution lines, what I would deem neighborhood lines with the neighborhoods, as those are normally put in as a cost of that development by the developer, and those are not, the city is normally not expending funds to put in water distribution lines. So for those existing assets in the column that is labeled 2022, city staff provided estimates of how much those assets are currently being utilized, or how much demand out of their total capacity is being used. So some of those for ground storage, elevated storage, and water transmission, we're basically assuming that there is no excess capacity in those parts of the system right now. And with water supply, water treatment, and water pumping, that there is some excess capacity in each one of those parts of the system. The column for 2032 is how much we think those assets are going to be utilized 10 years from now. So then we take that difference So in the case of water supply, that difference is 32.9% times the project cost for that particular asset. And that is the cost that goes into that 10-year cost allocation column. So you can see how we've done that for existing assets. For the proposed projects, each one of those projects came out of the latest capital improvements program for the city. All of those project costs have been reviewed by city staff to make sure that I interpreted those costs correctly out of the city's capital improvement program. And there, in that case, for 2022, the utilizations were zero because obviously those projects haven't been constructed yet. In the 2032 column, we do have percent estimated utilizations. Those utilizations came from city staff and have been reviewed by the engineering department. And so the same concept applies there. We take that percent utilization, the difference between 2032 and 2022, times the project cost, and that is the dollars that go into that 10-year column, which is really the column that we're most concerned about. So if we just look at, so on the water side, in that 10-year column for your existing assets, we have about $2.6 million worth of existing cost for existing assets that we can roll into this impact fee update, and about $135 million worth of proposed projects. Most of that $135 million is tied to the Alliance water supply project, and really just the future debt service associated with that project. So we contacted them and worked with them to get their estimated payments by the city over the next 10 years. And that's how we came up with that cost. We did split that cost. I will say this, we did split that cost. You can see Alliance Supply in there twice, once for water supply and once for water treatment. While the Alliance water supply, they themselves don't differentiate those costs between water supply and water treatment, we did want to make that distinction because while most of those costs are water supply, there is some minimal water treatment, even if it's just minimal chlorination at the well sites as well. So we did take our best guess at trying to split that cost into a water supply cost and a water treatment cost. The table on the bottom there basically just takes those costs up above and it adds the cost for the existing assets and the new assets for each one of these project types. And then we take that cost and we divide it by the 10-year growth in LUEs, or living unit equivalents. So on the water side, over the next 10 years, we're expecting that the city will add 9,637 LUEs. That's not necessarily 9,637 customers, but it's 9,637 LUEs. And at its core, basically what we're doing here with an impact fee, it's not necessarily rocket science, is we take those costs and we divide it by the growth in LUEs, and then that comes up with our cost per LUE for each one of these different asset types. So certainly on the water side, our two biggest costs over the next 10 years, the city's two biggest costs are going to be in water supply and additional ground storage. And if we add all of those costs per LUE up on the water side, we come up with a total of $14,253. So that is our cost before we apply any credits, which I'll get to in just a little bit. I'm not going to spend as much time going through the wastewater. The table's set up exactly the same, where we have our existing assets on top and then all of the proposed projects down below. The same data sources were used. The city's fixed asset system was used for the cost of the existing assets. All the future assets, their cost came from the city's latest capital improvement program. The percent utilizations came from city staff, been reviewed by the engineering department. So where we end up there is we have a total 10-year wastewater cost of just over $118 million, almost $119 million. On the wastewater side, we have a growth in LUEs of $13,682 for treatment and interceptors. For pumping, we have a growth of 7,074 LUEs. The pumping LUEs are just a little bit less because not 100% of the city's wastewater system is pumped. Some of it is gravity flow. So we could split that out between what we think that growth is going to be for the pumped portion of the system where they're utilizing lift stations. So on the wastewater side, we have a total cost per LUE of $8,957 before credits are applied. So once we get there and we've gone through that, the first column of this table is those cost per LUE factors that we saw on those previous two slides and those tables. Once we get to this point, Chapter 395 says that we have one of two options. We can either take those numbers and we can just cut them in half, and that becomes our new maximum allowable impact fee. Or we can take those numbers and we can go through what's called a rate credit calculation, subtract that rate credit, and then that number would become our new maximum allowable impact fee. The rate credit option, or both of these options, really arise from the fact that whenever new customers connect to your system, whether that's 2 years from now, 3 years from now, 4 years from now, those customers will pay for these assets in part through impact fees, but they will also pay a part of those assets through their water and wastewater utility rates. We always want to be fair and equitable, and anytime we're charging customers something, whether it's a water, wastewater rate, or an impact fee. And so this arises to make sure that we're not double charging those customers, that they're not paying for those assets through the impact fee and then also paying for the full cost of those assets through their utility rates. So Chapter 395 says one option would just be cut that in half. They assumed that no way is anyone paying for 50% of this through their utility rate, so surely that would be enough. Or, like I said, we can do a rate credit option, which we presented both options here. To calculate those rate credit numbers, we go through a process in which we look at the city's existing outstanding debt for water and wastewater assets. Then we take that CIP for both water and wastewater. We make some assumptions within that CIP about how those projects are going to be funded in the future. Are they going to be debt funded, or are they going to be cash funded? From that, we basically sum all those up on an annual basis. If projects are going to be cash funded, we take the cash value of those projects. If those projects are going to be debt funded, we take those projects' value, we convert that into an annual debt service payment over 10 years. Or we finance those projects over 20 years, but we're really concerned about what those costs are going to be over the next 10 years. So we sum those costs up over a 10-year period. So we end up with, this is the total money needed to fund these projects associated with growth over the next 10 years. The model that we use and that I use, we then have kind of an estimate of what we think the new updated impact fees are going to be for both water and wastewater. We know the number of new LUEs coming online over this 10-year period. So if we take those number of LUEs multiplied by our guess at what the new water and wastewater impact fees are going to be, we have total money coming in. So we know total money going out, we have total money coming in. That difference is going to have to be paid for through the utility rates. So then it becomes an iterative process where we work systematically. We make small changes in the impact fees until that solution kind of solves on itself and everything is made whole over this 10-year period. So that's how we come up with our rate credit option. We do take that percentage that we think is going to be paid for through the rates. We apply that to kind of the midpoint of the LUE growth over the 10-year period. And again, and then we kind of compare that again to that 10-year cost that we think we're going to have to put into the rates. So with all that that's said and done, that's a really long-winded explanation for this table. I just want to make sure that y'all kind of understand where all these numbers come from. So if we look at option A, which is doing the rate credit, you would come up with a total maximum allowable impact fee of $18,208. That'd be $12,037 for the water side, and then $6,171 for the wastewater side. You will see that I did add $1 in there for each one of those. That is the allocated cost of doing this study back to the impact fee. So you will recoup the cost of doing this study in your impact fee as well as customers connect to the system. So that's the good news there. If we look at option B and we just take half of the capital cost of new service, then we come up with a maximum allowable impact fee of $11,607. So Chapter 395 says that once you do both these options, that you can pick the higher of the two. So the last column, if we pick the higher of the two, it's obvious the rate credit. It's always going to be the rate credit if the consultant goes through the process of doing that. So if we want to see how this compares to some other cities, I know one of y'all before, so I don't forget, someone asked about the city of Austin. I have updated the report to include the city of Austin in this table. So City of Austin currently has a water impact fee of $4,700 and a wastewater impact fee of $2,500 for a total impact fee of $7,200. The City of Austin last updated their impact fees in 2018, so they will be updating them here relatively shortly because they have to go through this process every 5 years. So if we look at how that new maximum, if we take the $18,208 and how would that compare, it would certainly put you at the top of the list, or near the top of the list, not at the top of the list. When New Braunfels Utilities recently updated their impact fees, they catapulted themselves to the top of this list, and New Braunfels currently has the highest impact fees that I know of any utility in the state, with a total of $25,692. I will say that New Braunfels is actually in a very similar situation kind of to where the city of Kyle is, and if you look at their distribution between how their fee is split out between water and wastewater, New Braunfels is in the process of acquiring new water supplies as well. So that cost just really shot up the impact fee for that particular utility. It is more typical that impact fees in the state of Texas, really not just in this area, that we tried to pick similar sized cities that were close to Kyle. But if we were to look across the state, the typical impact fees in Texas, I would say, are anywhere from $7,000 to, you may have a few cities with a $12,000 or $13,000 impact fee. So $18,208 would certainly be on the high end. I want to kind of circle back just really quick to that second bullet of the why we are here slide. So this committee is not charged with making a recommendation to City Council. What you are simply charged with is making sure that the land use plan appears to be reasonable, that the CIP appears to be reasonable, and that to the best of your ability, you've determined that we have calculated this impact fee correctly. This body can choose to make a recommendation on what that new fee should be to City Council, but you do not have to. In most cases, the Impact Fee Advisory Committee will recommend that City Council adopt the maximum fee. However, I will say that in y'all's case, you're going to be a little bit different with this update, because if we did that, that would be almost tripling your current impact fees. So your current impact fees are $6,361 per LUE, and we've calculated a new maximum of a little over $18,000. So again, I don't need feedback on that tonight, but that is something for y'all to consider and think about is, one, as a body, do you want to make a recommendation to City Council, or do you want to remain silent on that issue and just say, we've done this report, we've made these findings, here's the new maximum impact fee, and City Council make that determination? Or do you want to make a recommendation to City Council about what you think the new maximum impact fee should be, the effective impact fee should be? And maybe that's the $18,208. Maybe that's $14,000. Maybe it's $10,000. Maybe it's some other number. So just consider that as you're going through this. I had another client that kind of wanted to know the pros and cons of a high versus a low impact fee. And some people will tell you that having a higher impact fee deters growth. I don't necessarily think that to be true for a few reasons. There's been several studies that have kind of said that is probably not the case. Some cities have tried to control growth in certain areas of their cities by charging differential impact fees, and in different areas of the city charging low impact fees for areas that they wanted to have growth, and higher impact fees in areas that they were trying to deter growth. And really what they found out is that did not make any difference in where people were living, that there was a whole lot of other decisions that were influencing that. But on the flip side of that, I just will say that anytime that we're dealing with financial matters, whether it's impact fees or whether it's utility rates, I believe that there is a science to that, and then there is an art to that. The science part of it is the spreadsheets and the report. And so we can go through this whole process and say, well, mathematically, this is the answer. But there is also an art to this, and I realize that we don't operate in a vacuum, that we do operate in a political system in which sometimes we make decisions for other means that are not necessarily because we know that this is the mathematical answer that we're going to make. We're going to determine that we want to have a different value for some other means, and that is perfectly normal, and that's perfectly acceptable. Anytime that you do reduce the impact fee, at least theoretically, that is additional money that would have to be made up through the water and wastewater utility rates. So if all of these projects were constructed at their cost and all of those costs came true over the next 10 years, you only have two choices of how to pay for those. It's either impact fees or water and wastewater utility revenue. So for every dollar less of revenue that we bring in through impact fees is a dollar more, at least theoretically, that we'll have to bring in from water and wastewater rates. So there is a trade-off there of lowering impact fees. But again, y'all are not the final decision-making body on what that should be. That will be City Council. What I would ask that you ponder over the next couple weeks, again, is just, do you want to make a recommendation to City Council and what that may be. So looking forward, we do have you approving this report at your next regularly scheduled meeting, I believe, which is March 28th. That's a Tuesday. And I do, by the way, appreciate y'all very much being here on your not regularly scheduled meeting times. I know y'all are accommodating my schedule because I've had meetings on Tuesday nights for the last 2 months. But on March 28th, I'm free, so we wouldn't have to have a special called meeting. We can meet at your normally scheduled time. If you start looking at this report and you're like, well, I'm certainly not going to feel comfortable making a decision on that in 2 weeks, then just let Leon know, and we can push that date back. That date is not written in stone. That's not a hard cutoff date of any type that says that we have to make a decision by that date. That was just y'all's next meeting after this meeting. At the March 28th meeting, that is when you would, by approving the report, if you so chose to, we would include a recommendation to council in there on what those new impact fees should be. If this report is approved on March 28th, Y'all are done as an impact fee advisory committee, at least as far as this report goes after that date. It's anticipated that we would present this report to council on April 4th and have them set a public hearing date at that time with a proposed public hearing date right now of May 16th for this update. So that is it for me. I understand that was a lot of information. So if you have any questions tonight, I'd be more than happy to answer those. If you have questions over the next 2 weeks, if you can email those to Leon, Leon can then forward those to me so that I know what those questions are, and I can either answer you individually, or I can formulate an answer and update the report as I need to based on your comments. And you can also ask questions at the March 28th meeting as well.
Thank you. Yes, any questions for staff? Yes, Commissioner Chase.
Can we go back to the LUE calculation page for water?
This one or the first one?
Yeah, this one here. So the growth in LUEs, I know you said that's not, single family, it's not number of customers, it's a combination of, size of line required to go in. Was that number correlated with the water supply percentage as well? So are we saying that those 9637 additional LUEs is what's impacting the 75% of the future proposed projects?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, city staff reviewed both the growth projections, and then input from that, they determined what those percent utilizations were going to be 10 years from now.
Okay. And then on the next page for wastewater, just a little bit more for my education and everybody's education, how is the wastewater number higher than the water? I'm assuming there's water places that currently don't have a wastewater line.
For growth in LUEs?
Yeah.
That is correct. So if you look at the service area map for the city, and Leon can correct me if I'm wrong, but there are actually other water service providers within the city limits of Kyle. So not even all of your city limits customers are served by the city of Kyle Water Utility. However, there are no other or very limited wastewater service providers within the city's service area. So you currently have a larger number of wastewater customers than you do water customers.
Okay. And then going back to where we're able to charge and not charge these, I just found out today that we actually have a customer that is not within the ETJ or the city limits that we have an agreement with where our water is supplied. Are there any additional areas like that need to be taken into account on this? And I'm looking at Will more than
Good evening, Commissioners. Leon Barba, City Engineer. Could you repeat the question?
So we have a customer right now. What's the name of the development?
Waterstone?
Waterstone.
Is that right?
That is going to be using city water and wastewater, but they're not within the ETJ or within the city. So are there other areas like that where the city's going to be serving customers that are not within those two areas that could have potential effects on our ability to charge?
What are we doing with Waterstone in that?
So Waterstone, it is in our water and wastewater CCN already,
Yes.
right? So we're charging them LUEs based off that. The other one I can think of is Anthem, which is in neither.
They're in Mountain City's ETJ,
Right.
but they are in our water CCN.
We're providing service to both,
Yes.
but they're not I'll double check.
Okay.
So
I'm just wondering if there are more additional areas like that Mr. Reed may have not been made aware of that may impact this as well.
One of the dilemmas we have right now is that we have 4 different water providers, and that kind of complicates things when we're trying to calculate these impact fees.
Yeah.
So whenever a new business, new home, or new complex comes in, we have to make sure that we're able to charge them the water impact fee and the wastewater impact fee. Sometimes we do miss it and have to remind ourselves that they're not in our water system, but they are using our wastewater. So we will charge them a wastewater impact fee. So I'm not sure if I'm answering your question. There could be, but I just don't think there's that many, if any, at all.
Okay. Well, no, because Mr. Reed mentioned in the beginning, if they're not in your ETJ, you can't charge them unless there's
That's
a
correct.
contract
That's
agreement. Okay.
And we will make that clear in the report if it's not in there. In that section, I will go back in and add a sentence or two that says that the city can also extend these charges to other city or other entities outside of the TTJ through contract.
Okay, thank you. That was it.
Were you, okay, good. Commissioner James.
So, if I'm understanding correctly, part of our duty on this, as this board, is to determine whether the land use basis is done properly, which is the growth patterns that came into the 2032 numbers. Is that correct?
That is correct. That
Okay.
those acreages appear to be reasonable.
Okay. And so those are based off of growth projections, correct?
They are. We started the city's, I don't remember exactly when the city's last comprehensive plan was done. I believe it was around 2018, 2019 timeframe. Does that sound about right?
there was an update at that time, but the foundation of that update was 2010. So there was one in, it's actually 2017, a minor update in 2019, and then we're actually working on one right now.
In the last update to the city's comprehensive plan, there was an actual land use map in that plan that had was actually really well done and had these land use categories. They were a little bit more than these. I've kind of condensed these down, but these land use categories were included along with their acres in 2018 or 2017. So last time we did this plan, these impact fees, that actually coincided with that comprehensive plan update. So it was really easy to come up with current acres. We just simply clicked those right out of the latest comprehensive plan. So, for example, the acres in this current column, those started with those exact acres that came out of the comprehensive plan, but unfortunately now that is 5 years dated. And so we tried to update those as best we could for that intervening growth between 2018 and now. And then again, looking forward in the future, we tried to, as best we could, to say, okay, what is this going to look like 10 years from now?
Okay. So my question is on that assumption specifically. How is it just the last 5 years we're using for a growth rate? Like, what are we using for how we determine the growth rate in this case?
Hold on 1 second, and I can tell you the growth rate that we're using for this. So we are utilizing a growth rate of 5% per year. That's what we used in the last impact fee update. And we didn't necessarily see any reason to change that, but if we do need to change that, we can. That's no big deal.
So as a follow-up question to the planning staff, how accurate have we been to that 5% growth rate since that last time?
Will Atkinson for the director, or as the director of planning, for the record. Offhand, this is an approximate, and I'm going to give you an actual permit numbers for residential permits primarily. In the last several years, we've been seeing in between 1,500 to 1,500 plus a year. and translating that into on average of 3 people per household, and that's the average between multifamily units and single family. So if it's varied about 3,000 to 4 to 5,000 people a year, depending on the year, and that for residential permits in our service areas. So you're looking, and that's both city limits and ETJ. So it goes up and down depending on the year, depending on the economy and all that. But and that actually might be on the high side, that number too. So what's that?
That doesn't include retail, commercial. I mean, when we're talking about
Not
water,
offhand.
wastewater,
Yeah,
they're also a customer.
the building department keeps track of those numbers also, but offhand I don't have them. So, but we're getting a lot of people coming to the area, and at 5%, that's probably all right from offhand from a consideration perspective, increase year over year.
Thank you. Any other questions for staff? Yes, go ahead.
Yes, I just want to be clear about this. If we get a number right in terms of the charges, the current customers will not be bearing significant expense of this growth, this development.
That is correct. This updated impact fee would only apply to new customers coming onto the system. So if you're an existing customer, this does not have any bearing on you. And in fact, actually, just to be clear, these new impact fee numbers, whatever they end up being, would only apply to new developments platted after the effective date of the ordinance that updates the impact fees. So even if there's a development that has already been platted, they have been platted under the current impact fees.
The follow-up, I don't know that we can answer this, but in the case of inflation or other uncertainties, might it be the case, though, that customers might bear some of this development costs for infrastructure?
So again, in a perfect world, impact fees would generate enough revenue that growth would pay for growth, and your current customers wouldn't pick up any of the cost of adding capacity to the system. In the real world, that's just not the way that it works, for a variety of reasons. And so the fact of the matter is that in a city that's growing as rapidly as Kyle, your existing customers, they are going to pay for some of this infrastructure related to growth through their water and wastewater rates. There's no way around it. Having the highest impact fees that you can charge helps to reduce that burden on the water and wastewater rates and shifts that balance more towards growth paying for growth.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Go ahead. Everybody goes.
Hi. So one question that I had when I was looking at the slide for the water cost allocation and wastewater allocation, I'm struggling to understand why we are using the percent utilization to do the costing, because the project has to be paid for no matter how much it's being utilized. So why are we using that percentage to cost it?
That is, according to Chapter 395, that's what we have to do. We have to look at the cost of that project from either a utilization standpoint or a cost per OUE standpoint, and then apply growth to that, so that we basically end up with the cost of that project within that 10-year window. I understand what you're saying, and I understand that you're paying for 100% of that cost now.
Yeah.
And so why not just include all of that cost into the impact fees? But then what you're doing is you're basically rolling, if you roll 100% of that cost into the impact fees, then your customers, again, theoretically, at least over the next 10 years, would pay for 100% of that cost. So if I connect to your system in year 12, 13, 14, then I'm getting a free ride if I'm using that asset because it's already been paid for.
But the people who are living in Kyle for the next 12 to 15 years before you get to that point are the ones who are actually paying for everything.
They will pay for a portion of it.
Yeah. So I did a little, back of the envelope calculation using the information on the, what is it? Impact fee calculation slide. So there's a variance between obviously what we're expecting people to pay and what the costs are estimated to be. So if this cost is already not reflecting 100% of what the cost of the projects are, there's going to be an even bigger gap. But the difference I calculated right now was about 21.3 million for the water costs not covered by the impact fee, and 31.9 million for the wastewater costs not covered by the impact fee. That's just over a 10-year period, multiply, for each LUE, not for each LUE, but altogether. So if we're already looking at 21 million and 32 million roughly that are not accounted for, and that's not even taking into account the 25% of some of these new projects that wouldn't be reflected in this calculation, I'm a little bit nervous that we're maybe biting off more than we can chew, and that money is going to then fall on the people who live here in the form of debt or increased pricing. So I don't know if that made sense. It makes sense on my spreadsheet, but when I try to put my spreadsheet into words, sometimes it gets a little mixed up. But I'm concerned about the cost here.
No, I do understand where you're coming from, but according to Chapter 395, we can really only look at that cost in the next 10-year window. We do understand that if those projects are financed by debt, that debt repayment is going to be over 20 or 30 years, and so that spreads that project cost out over a much longer period beyond that 10-year window, so that those new customers that are coming on in year 10, 11, 12, that they pay for a portion of that project then. Also, these do have to be updated every 5 years. So as those project costs change, if there's a project that comes out of this in 5 years, then these would be updated to reflect that.
Let's see. I'll stop there for now.
Okay, thank you. Just to follow up on that, so for our city staff, so that extra money, that extra 25% or whatever it is, that's just debt, and then that we will be paying back later as we get more people in the future, and that gets to 100%? Or is the city paying for it now? Is it being put into the wastewater and water fees now for our current customers? Well, yeah, that was a valid question. Where is that extra money coming from? Is it just additional debt, or is it somewhere else?
I think some of it is paid for in the monthly service fees for the water and wastewater, a portion of it. Although some of that is utilized to pay for operations also. Some of it, if there's capital improvement projects that have to happen that are not funded through the general fund, would have to be also taken into account from a debt perspective. But we have to be very careful about that, of course, too, about when debt is issued and what have you, just to make sure that the city's bond rating and its debt ratio are manageable and kept in the best tip-top shape possible. That's something of a non-answer, but we also don't have our finance director here either, who could probably better answer the question. So,
and then also, if we don't actually have the 9,637 new LUEs that we think we're going to have, again, that additional money would also be probably in the cost of the water and wastewater, because it has to be paid for somewhere, right? So if that number is wrong, it could cause an issue if it's higher than the actual count. Okay, thank you. Any other questions? Everybody gets to go once. Okay. Yes, go ahead.
Hi, thank you so far. I want to revisit the growth rate part, which bears directly on the number of LUEs that's projected here. I think it's a little cavalier to say it's about 5%. I think we deserve to see a calculation based on that, because all of these things, the cost per LUE depends on the number of LUEs we're expecting. So I would charge that to
If we were to increase your growth rate, it would drive your impact fees down. If your actual growth rate is less than 5% a year, your maximum impact fee would go up. Because the dollars stay the same. So we'd be dividing the dollars by more or less units.
So are you saying it's advantageous to have a higher projected growth rate?
If you
So
want a
that-
higher impact fee, it's more advantageous to use a lower growth rate.
Use a lower
It'll create a
growth-
higher impact fee.
Okay, okay.
So we can certainly work with the city's planning department to see what those growth rates have been over the last several
Please.
years.
Does
Please,
that-
yes. I would definitely like to see that for the next meeting. I'm going to start going back if everyone else is, okay. Commissioner Chase?
So just a couple comments as we were going down the line here. I think that that 5% is pretty low. Will just said we had an average of 1,500 just single-family homes permits. So I think the number is low, so I don't have an issue with the 5%. But that's just my opinion. I'd love to hear what city staff has to say at the next meeting. And then same thing with the debt service. I mean, these are going to be, City of Kyle doesn't have 130 plus million in the bank to pay for this outright today. So these are going to be bonded projects, I'm assuming, at least the larger number one. So seeing that spread across, every customer will end up paying a similar share at the end of the day. But even those that come in at the end, they're going to pay a similar share. So those are my only two comments.
Thank you. Commissioner James?
So, also I see a big driver of this water cost allocation is the proposed projects. And we talked about at the beginning of this how this is all just things that are city-born, and when developers essentially develop a water tank and kick it in and dedicate it to the city, it doesn't count towards this total. But I do see on here a couple times where the city is either paying for something that is in a specific neighborhood that would have been developed, or the city's contributed to it, like the water tank and Anthem Plum Creek development. My question is, does the assumption on this continue that the same amount of this activity is going on, so that developers aren't going to kick back any less or more of these, that we're not having to pay for more tanks down the line?
So let me try to answer that question. Then if I don't answer it correctly, then maybe city staff can answer it. There are a couple of projects in here that are labeled city's contribution. And at least right now, those are our best guess at what the city is going to kick in towards that project, and the developer will pay for the rest. Again, we cannot include anything in this capital improvements list that we, at least right now, would believe to be developer constructed and built, because the city is not expending funds to add capacity to its system. That does not preclude a developer from coming in and building any of these projects. And so if a developer was to come in and build a storage tank or a transmission line, then they would be, at that time, they would be due a credit against that, at least that portion of the impact fee for building that piece of infrastructure. But right now, what we have in this list is our best estimate of what the city is going to expend over the next 10 years. Did that answer your question, or?
I think it's good. I think it's good enough. I don't know if we can get the core of the question, but I think that might be a little too much conjecture. So I think that answers the best I can.
Thank you. Any other questions for staff? Yes, go ahead, Mr. Chico.
So a higher fee, generally speaking, is going to result in lower indebtedness, bond indebtedness for current customers.
A higher impact fee will generally would generally mean you would have lower utility rates than if the impact fees were lower. Now, I can't speak to bond indebtedness because that's a city financial decision about how they want to pay for these projects. If you do have a higher impact fee, you can basically bank that money. According to Chapter 395, the city is supposed to have a separate impact fee fund. So these funds are not commingled within the city's O&M funds for water and wastewater. So the city can bank funds within that impact fee fund and then use to pay cash for projects instead of issuing debt for those projects. That's one option. Or the city may choose that they would rather issue debt for some of these projects, and then you can use impact fee proceeds to pay for the debt service portion of that debt. So at least not all of the debt gets rolled into the water and wastewater rates. But again, that's an individual decision that the city makes. Some use this money to pay debt service. Some would prefer to kind of bank this money for 2 or 3 years and then pay cash for a project.
Thank you. I think this discussion tonight and these questions actually are helping, I think, the council with some important thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions? Go ahead.
Just to clarify, at the end of the day, the impact fees collected in a perfect world would cover all the debt. So if it's a 20-year bond, for 20 years, your expected impact fee would cover the cost of that bond. So you're not having to pass it on to your current customers. So that way, like I said, everybody's paying their fair share. It's where you screw up and say, okay, we're going to take a 30-year bond, but don't take into a factor growth rate over 30 years. And towards the tail end, you say, okay, we have $10 million worth of bond left that now needs to be distributed amongst our customers. Well, you do that at the beginning, and that's where you see the pass on. Again, I'm a finance guy, but I'm not a bond guy. But that's my understanding of how the impact fees would work if it was a bonded project. So the impact fees would go towards paying towards that bond instead of passing that bond cost on to your customers. At least that's my opinion, my understanding of how that
is true.
works.
That's what I said. Impact fee proceeds, they can be used to pay for debt service on projects related to growth.
And let's say we had 12,000 LUEs every year. Just like you said, any of that overage, the city can either bank it to either pay for or pay the debt service off early. It's up to it's at their discretion.
Yeah.
I have one more question, Mr. Chairman.
Yes, sir.
So, Mr. Reed, the costs for projects here, are those in 2023 present value dollars?
Those, yes. We did
Okay.
not inflate those
Right.
to future construction
But
dollars.
that's purely the construction costs, doesn't include, debt costs or anything like that, if those were incurred. Is that true?
No, yes, you're correct. That project cost is just the construction cost of the projects.
Right, thanks.
Go ahead.
So I know that we have to do this cost allocation based on the Chapter 395, but is there any way that we could get that kind of information about the present value of the cost if we took like an average inflation rate or interest rate or something like that, so we could get a picture of, I don't know, what the real costs would be, not whatever Chapter 395 requires? Are we allowed to do that? I feel like I could make a better decision if I had real numbers instead of these numbers that the law asks for, but the law is not rational. It doesn't
Are
make
you
sense.
asking what those project costs would be if we inflated them to when we expect them to be constructed?
Yeah, inflate them to when you expect them to be constructed. If there is some information available about whether it's cash or debt driven, which I think y'all factored that in, maybe looking at how many years that, the interest would be accruing on that debt, what it would look like. Because we're talking about numbers that are today's numbers, and the interest rates right now are kind of increasing and unstable, and inflation is also quite high. So if we think these are the numbers now, and we approve a, what is it, 17, 18 $1,000 LUE, what if it ends up being like $25,000 would have really been the best number, and we've really screwed over our constituent, the people in the city, because we use low numbers. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does, and
Okay.
we can look at what those project costs would look like whenever they're constructed. I would have to work with city staff because I don't necessarily know what year
Sure.
they was expected to be constructed in. I will say that your concern is well-founded, especially in today's environment with inflation, what it is, and I know I don't have to tell you all, but the construction sector, has seen incredible inflation over the last 2 years, and so the remedy to that is unfortunately one of the remedies is kind of redoing this stuff. You have to redo these impact fees at least every 5 years. Certainly in high inflation scenarios like we have now, we've seen cities decide to do them every 3 years or every 2 years to try to account for that, because as those project costs change and as those project costs go up, that should, in theory, force the impact fees up to kind of keep pace with those project costs.
Thank you very much for being here today and giving us all this information. It's very helpful. I know that for me, I just want to minimize the impact for people in my community who are existing residents, and make sure that, we're being good stewards of their money that might be limited. And
No, I do understand that, and with what I presented you tonight, so that I do believe that we are following the Chapter 395 process
I have no doubt
as we
that you
can.
are. Yeah.
So, like I said before, while it may not be comfortable increasing your impact fees 3 times over, having a higher impact fee is the way to reduce charges to the best that you can to your existing customers, at the expense of adding on costs to new customers as they connect to the system.
Thank you.
It's a trade-off.
I have a question. So when you gave us that chart with option A or option B, the 50% or the rate credit, you said we were allowed to choose the higher of the two.
That is correct.
And so then, just to clarify, to make sure that hypothetically we couldn't say we want it to be the higher one plus a certain amount. He says, so the higher one, is that the maximum that we're allowed to recommend?
That is the maximum.
Okay.
Yes. So the ultimate decision that council will make, that value represents the maximum impact fee that you can levy. So you can levy an effective impact fee that's anywhere between 0 and up to that cap.
Okay.
Dollar amount.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
Just one quick question for our next meeting. Just because you mentioned it there at the end, I'd like to see proof of that comment you made. That higher impact fees equals lower service fees for residents, because that's a big comment to make.
Well,
so
and
if you make that comment, you got to back it up with me.
Well, and I'll try to figure out how I can do that empirically without having the city's rate model. But at the end of the day,
Well, there's got to be a case study of other cities that have increased. New Braunfels just skyrocketed their fees. Though granted, I know that just happened, so you're not going to see an impact.
yeah.
there
Well,
yet,
like I said, at the end of the day, if you have a project that costs $2 million, that project cost is what it is, and you have 2 buckets of money that you can pull from to fund that project if you have impact fees. One of those being impact fees, and one of those being utility rates.
Mm-hmm.
So for that $2 million, if I can bring in $1.5 million in impact fees, then I only have to put $500,000 of that project into my utility rates. Conversely, if I can only bring in $500,000 of impact fees, then I have to put $1.5 million of that project into my utility rates.
Yeah, on paper it's great, but in practice is what I'm asking for. So if you make a comment, I've got to have practice.
I can tell you that I don't know of any studies that have tried to link impact fees to utility rates, just because there's so many variables going on with utility rates as a whole, that trying to make that causative link is tenuous at best.
Okay.
I would love to back that
I
statement
would just say
up
be
with a
careful
study.
making that statement, because I know there are a few folks on here that were like, oh, that's great. But it might not be true.
Well, yes.
Because on paper, Tua Tagovailoa with the Miami Dolphins is an amazing quarterback, but he's out half the time with concussions, right? So reality, paper, there's two different things there.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions? All right, I think we are done with item number 4. Thank you. Item number 5, adjournment. I would like to make a motion to adjourn. Second. It's been motioned and seconded. Any discussion? All those in favor say aye. Aye. All opposed? We are adjourned.